Welcome to HDTV. You now rocking with your boy. Well, in the USA Today article by Marco Delia Cava, 2020 census emergency threatens to leave out communities of color and rural Americans. Irma Cruz uses her soft voice and reassuring smile to try to persuade Latino residents of El Paso, Texas to fill out the 2020 census. The civil rights activist explains that being counted as part of the official U.S. population means more money for their families and neighbors, as well as a voice in Congress. But these days it's a tough sell. Many of those living in the historic Segundo Barrio neighborhood are too busy working to fill out the form, they tell her. Some don't have the language skills to fill out the form, which only is available in English, and many are worried the government might use the information against them. I tell them not to worry, their data is protected by federal law, but they still worry, says Cruz, policy and civic engagement campaign coordinator for the civil rights group Border Network for Human Rights. It's kind of an emergency now. People need to understand how important this is. For many communities across the nation, especially people of color and those living in rural areas, the calculus is simple and dire. Fill out the 2020 census or risk a historic undercount that could jeopardize everything from a share in $1.5 trillion in federal funding to political representation in Congress. While historians note that each census count, which happens every 10 years, has its struggles, this one has been rife with challenges, including a global pandemic, a historic recession, and interference from President Donald Trump. These include a failed attempt to add a citizenship question to the census, a memorandum calling to exclude unauthorized immigrants from the count, and a last-minute directive to speed up the count completion by 4 weeks. Activists see these measures against people of color, folks hit hardest by both COVID-19 illness and deaths and by pandemic-fueled unemployment, as an attempt by the administration to hurt Democratic voters. They have filed a number of lawsuits to require a full count of anyone living in the U.S. and extend the census data collection deadline. We are in a race against the clock, says Judy Reese Morse, president and CEO of the Urban League of Louisiana in New Orleans. She says her staff is working overtime to demystify the census while also explaining that not being counted could have dire effects on schools, communities, service programs, and hospitals. We must not let up, add Morse. There is no other option for us. Morse and others are hoping their efforts get people to self-report either by phone or online. Meanwhile, the Census Bureau just days ago started its standard practice of sending representatives into the field to visit so-called hard-to-count households, typically folks located in poor rural and urban areas where the rate of self-reporting is sometimes 20% to 50% lower than fairly typical self-reporting national average of 63%. At first, this outreach effort, postponed from the spring due to COVID-19, gave volunteers until October 31st to contact these groups. But on August 3rd, that deadline was moved up to September 30th because, according to the census, that was the only way numbers could be tabulated in time to meet our statutory deadline of December 31st, 2020, as required by law and directed by the Secretary of Commerce. Excuse me. For its part, the Census Bureau says it is committed to a complete and accurate 2020 census despite the accelerated timeline, according to a statement from Bureau Director Stephen Dillingham. The statement says the Bureau has a robust field data collection operation, adding that it plans to add additional training sessions and provide rewards to enumerators, those in the field trying to reach hard-to-count households who maximize hours worked. The task facing the Bureau's field reporters is daunting. In 2010, census volunteers had 48 million housing units to visit in 10 weeks. This time it's 56 million households in just 6 weeks. We're talking about communities that already have low census reporting numbers, and now you add the COVID-19 crisis in the way Latino and Black people are wary about this administration, and you have a bad situation, says Roberto Bustillo, an organizing director at Proyecto Pastoral, which focuses on LA's heavily Latino Boyle Heights area. His team of volunteers are feverishly working the phones and hanging flyers on doors to encourage people to fill out the census. Across the country in Miami, the Reverend Rhonda Thomas normally would have been using churches to spread the word, but because of the health crisis, is turning to digital communications and visits to polling stations to push her Black neighbors to be counted. Historically, we are a people that has been left out, says Thomas. Being counted affects everything, the quality and size of our hospitals, schools, community centers. We need to be included. Maps show huge census undercounts in Texas. A review of the Census Bureau Hard to Count map highlights areas of concern, including the many neighborhoods with heavy Latino and Black populations that have yet to respond. Texas stands out with the majority of its counties showing fewer than 50% of residents self-reporting their census information. Edwards County, hard by the Rio Grande River, is at just 14.8%. Other heavily undercounted areas include almost all of New Mexico, California's Central Valley, the southern half of Georgia, and the largely Native American Four Corners region where Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona meet. In 2010, there were undercounts of people of color and Native Americans on reservations. And it seems that now with even more households to visit in less time, the undercount risk being much worse, says Stephen Romalewski, who is keeping a close eye on the map as part of the City University of New York Center for Urban Research at the Graduate Center. It's worrisome. A large center undercount will cast a long shadow, experts say. Census numbers hang around for a decade and are used for all sorts of government policies, says Margot J. Anderson, distinguished professor emerita in history and urban studies at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and author of the American Census, a social history. So we don't think these numbers we get are any good. We're going to have a very complicated conversation about what to do next. Put more bluntly, if the census is screwed up, it will have dramatic implications for all parts of society, says Andrew Reamer, research professor at George Washington University's Institute of Public Policy in Washington, D.C. The census is foundational for democracy as it affects redistricting and for the efficient and fair distribution of taxpayer money. Many civil rights organizations are both pushing hard to get people to fill out the census while also engaging in legal and social action. To the outside world, cutting the census short by 4 weeks might seem like no big deal, but it's of huge consequence, says Vanity Gupta, president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a Washington, D.C. based group that has been serving as a clearinghouse for census count activism. The accelerated deadline threatens to shortchange people of color as well as low-income people and the homeless of all races. We need to press the Senate to extend the reporting deadline, even if it means announcing the results in 2021. We can't let the pressure off. This has to be done. Groups fight back with lawsuits and outreach. That pressure includes a recent letter signed by 900 national and community organizations urging Senate leaders Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, and Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, to add a provision to the next COVID-19 relief bill that would give the Census Bureau 4 more months until April 2021 to report its findings. The census count isn't just about political power, but it is also a tool to use by the private sector to decide where to put that next mall or store. Real bread and butter stuff that determines where you might be able to shop or work locally. Says Howard Feinberg, co-founder of the Census Project, the nation's largest census advocacy group, which organized the letter sent to McConnell and Schumer. Feinberg notes that a big undercount is likely to impact rural areas that already face limited commission commercial, and federal resources. Places like Bighorn County, Montana, population 13,000, where 82% of the population currently is uncounted by the 2020 census, or Rich County, Utah, 1,800, where 88% have yet to respond. This is all about letting people know you exist, he says. The president has specific ideas of who should be counted in the census. Just as we do not give political power to people who are temporarily, we should not give political power to people who should not be here at all. Trump said in the July statement explaining his desire to not count undocumented immigrants. A range of Republican lawmakers, including U.S. Republicans Chip Roy in Texas and Brian Mast in Florida, Republicans Chip Roy in Texas and Brian Mast in Florida have applauded the president's efforts. A Pew Research Center study indicates that Florida, Texas, and California all stand to lose one congressional seat under Trump's new apportionment plan. Terry A.O. Menace, Senior Director of Census and Voting Programs at the Civil Rights Advocacy Group Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, says activist groups are reached out to Asian Americans to explain the role and importance of the census through social media and other outreach in 15 languages, including Cantonese, Urdu, Tagalog, and Bengali. We just have to redouble our efforts to tell people that they can and should be counted without fear that their information will be used against them by the government, says Menes, whose group filed the amended legal complaint along with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. People need to know they can still respond, she says, is vital. Running out of time to count every American. John Thompson, a statistician who directed the Census Bureau until 2017 and oversaw planning for the 2020 census, isn't confident this count will be accurate simply because of the outsized number of households census workers need to reach during a pandemic in an unusual restricted time frame. There could mean a notable redistribution of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives, which could further push the Southern political landscape in favor of Republicans at a time when issues important to people of color, from police brutality to social social equality front and center. From the police brutality to social equality are front and center. There's a lot of concern that goes beyond party lines, said Thompson. Myself and other colleagues worry the census will not be suitable for apportionment. Local activists say they aren't counting on the Census Bureau officials changing the new September 31st deadline. Instead, they boasted their efforts to both boost voter registration and census response rates among people of color. We are in a state of emergency, says Melanie Campbell, president of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, which organized a recent strategy call between the organizations. We have to make sure we don't lose power. The NCBCP and other such groups are pivoting from each person outreach efforts to social media outreach on Facebook and Twitter. There are also plans to hand out census material at food distribution and COVID-19 testing sites. One positive sign some advocates say is a recent spike in census response rates in places that also have had social justice activities, including protests and rallies in New York and Los Angeles. That uptick is believed to be tied to a specific need of the community to figure out ways to be relevant, ways to actually impact the system, says Austin Patrick, a strategist for Black/African American research for Team Y&R, and communications firm contracted by the census. Other activists say they are doing Yeah, mostly activists say they are doing whatever they can to get people to get over the fear and mistrust of associated with filling out the census, maybe now more than ever, says Edward Hales, general counsel for the Advancement Project, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit focusing on racial justice issues. Hale says his organization is helping local partners leverage technology and media to promote census self-reporting through the familiar approach of radio spots and social media messages, but he's feeling the pressure. For the government to suddenly say we are going to stop short on collection, that just puts a huge burden on nonprofit groups to get the word out, especially under COVID-19 restrictions, he says. But we will do everything we can. The NALEO Education Fund, or the NALEO Educational Fund, a nonpartisan nonprofit aimed at boosting Latino civic engagement, also is earmarking funds for targeted media messaging in cities and counties with low self-response rates, such as Yuma, Arizona, Fresno, California, and New York City's Bronx borough. Lizette Escobedo, director of NALEO's National Census Program, says some of the NALEO's field officers are finding that even though there is no question on the census about citizenship, its ghost lingers. Even though the Supreme Court struck down having a citizenship question on the census, 50% of the people we ask still expect to find that question, she says. That makes them hesitant. In her search and her outreach efforts across Texas, Genesis Sanchez has found that for many Latinos, concerns over health safety and job security join the fear that their information will be used against them. I'm very worried because as Latinos think about their current and future political power, they have to understand that a census undercount would negatively impact that power, says Sanchez, NALEO's Texas Regional Census Campaign Manager. But we have to keep fighting to the last bit. She says all these communities deserve to be fairly represented, both financially and politically. So what do you feel? Do you feel that people should give their information to the census? I remember I did the census one year. It was pretty good. It had its pros and cons. But what it's saying in the article is when you put down how many people you have in a household and basically what area you're in, it basically gives you the perks of getting more funds towards your neighborhood, more funds to your community. It can help grow your community. So if your community is down and you show that you have a lot of people who are very stable, not on drugs, getting their job done, they'll be able to add things like a park, like a court and things like that if you fight for it. But if you're not going to fight for it, then it's worthless. But the census to me has never been a problem. Depends on who you get to interview you with. Now, the thing also with Latinos and Latinas, if you're basically have on, if you basically have, what was I trying to say? Basically, if you guys are immigrants, aren't from here, I could understand why you're scared to sign that because you don't know if it'll affect you, if it'll send a family member back who could end up being really your daughter or your mom being sent back. So to me, this is a thing where we have to sign it, but before we sign it, we have to look at it. And we have to take our time instead of just rushing in. But not Shaquille O'Neal. I am tripping. I apologize. But but the blacks and Latinos are being affected most because that's who they're trying to defund those areas. They want to keep Latinos and blacks down. They want to keep them apart. They want to keep them going at it with each other, fighting one another. So we don't have a lot of togetherness. But To me, what do you think? Do you think they should sign the census, or do you think they should just say whatever and bypass it? I am tired. I'm finna get me some sleep. So let me know what you feel. Like, comment, share, and hit the notification bell. When you hit it, please select all, so you can get upcoming content. And we're out. Live boy.